Welcome to Sattva Project. Dr. Ian Baker, one of our advisors. We are going to start this interview with an open mind and open heart. So Dr. Ian Baker is an Himalayan and Buddhist scholar and author of 7 books on Tibetan cultural history, environment, art, and medicine, including The Heart of the World, The Tibetan Art of Healing, The Dalai Lama's Secret Temple, and the forthcoming Tibetan Yoga, Secrets from the Source. He is a fellow of the Explorers Club and was recognized by National Geographic Society as one of 7 explorers for the millennium for his ethnographic and geographic field research in Tibet, Sampo Gorje, and his team's discovery of a waterfall that have been the source of myth and geographical speculation for more than a century. He is an executive board member of Himalayan Consensus Institute and works internationally as a consultant and lecturer in environment and cultural heritage conservation. From 2013 to 2016, he worked for London's Wellcome Trust as curator of an exhibition of Himalayan art entitled Tibetan Secret Temple, Body, Mind, and Meditation in Tantric Buddhism, to which he contributed both film and photography from Bhutan and Tibet. Additional information is available on his personal website, www.ianbaker.com. Very welcome, Dr. Ian Baker.
Thank you very much. And I should just say, after that very kind introduction, just to update it, is that my website is kind of, let's just say, suspended. I mean, it's there. And so people, I think, can access it, but it will probably just say it's under construction, under revision, under reconstruction. But it has both my, the email that's connected to the website, which is just ian@ianbaker.com, or I think I also put ianbaker108@gmail.com, and people are welcome to contact me on either of those. So that's just a little update. And also, I should say, another update from that, what you read from, is that my book, Tibetan Yoga, which was originally to be titled Secrets from the Source, was retitled by the publishers, Tibetan Yoga Practices and Principles and Practices, and that actually was published now in 2019. So that's out and available. And but as you said, I am working on another book now, which is forthcoming, and that will be trying to look at, I think, some of what we're discussing today, or how do some of these really sometimes esoteric aspects of Buddhism, how do they become applicable and relevant in our contemporary lives, which are so different from the way these kind of practices emerged in medieval India and the very isolated world of Tibet and the Himalayan kingdoms.
Well, I'm overwhelmed to be here in front of you and be willing to and able to do these kind of questions to you. So let's start very smoothly. Like we already know, Dr. Ian Baker, that you are a brilliant academic and that your works and books on the Himalayans and Tibetan yoga are just simply amazing. But behind that, there is a Ian. So who are you? What brought you into yoga studies and why yoga?
Okay. Well, I should say that, whatever my academic hat is, you could say, that aspect was really something that came later for me. My primary interest in Buddhism and, let's say, Tantric Yoga, all of these things was very much began with personal interest and then personal immersion. And then it was only later that I thought it would be interesting and useful to gain a certain kind of critical perspective on the practices that I had been immersed in while living, as I did for decades, in Nepal and the Himalayas, and long retreats and all of that. So just to explain a little bit of that, I had the great fortune to go quite early on in the 1970s to Kathmandu, where I met my who became my great teacher, Chatral Rinpoche. Actually, his You can see a photograph of him on the
Yes,
wall.
very clearly. Yes.
Yeah.
We
So
can
anyway, he
see
was a very
wonderful.
extraordinarily inspiring, and I still remember, so vividly. I was only 19 at the time when I met him, but it really was a life-changing meeting because I just felt, okay, this is something I can relate to, and and it was like meeting, I often describe, well, what was he like? He was like meeting Merlin, kind of like a wizard, because, this wasn't a monk. It wasn't an abbot of a monastery. He was in a retreat hut and, with this long beard and the white and the red robes. It was just something so magical for me. And the way that he, so the connection that I had through that was, because at that time I was very much involved in mountaineering and climbing, and that's actually what had originally drawn me to the Himalayas, was the mountains and the prospect of losing myself in the high Himalayan world, rather than Buddhism in particular. So I became quite fascinated. I was also an artist at the time. I was doing a lot of painting, and so I started to learn Tibetan scroll painting, and I went up into the mountains to study with a teacher there. And what I found fascinating was that although that was very prescriptive how you would actually outline and paint a Buddhist deity, there was a lot more of creative license in painting the surrounding landscape. And so there we were, kind of in his workshop. I'd look out the windows, and there were these huge Himalayan peaks. And I also saw in some of the work that he'd done, there were these amazing images of waterfalls with caves behind them, and really like lost worlds. And so I became very intrigued by what the symbolism was of, all of the landscape symbolism that was a subtle, you could say, analog to the deity. So you'd have wrathful deities that had wrathful landscapes, and you'd have peaceful deities with very pacific landscapes. And so I was very interested in that. And then he told me about this tradition of hidden lands, Beyul, which I, sounded imaginary. And yet he's, no, these are very real, very hard to get to. They're over, you have to climb, So that, of course, captured my imagination entirely. So then when I went back to Kathmandu and met with Chatral Rinpoche after that, I asked him about these hidden lands, the Beyul, because I had actually heard that he himself, had been to one of these places. And he looked at me, and this was sort of just the beginning of this very, on one level, unconventional, at the same time very deeply traditional relationship, guru disciple relationship, because it was very, very individualized and personalized. And so rather than answering my question, he said, "Can you spend a month alone?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Well, when you have a month free, please come back and see me, and I'll send you to a hidden land, to a Beyul, and then you won't have to ask me what they are. You'll know for yourself." So that was this challenge that he set for me, and it was my, in some ways, back door into Buddhist practice. And I wrote about a lot of that in the book that you mentioned, The Heart of the World: A Journey to Tibet's Lost Paradise, which begins with my apprenticeship, you could say, when he sent me to a series of different caves to do a series of different kinds of practices that were really about firsthand experience. They were, when we think of Buddhism, and which is what's so wonderful about the Sattva project that you've initiated, is how do we make all of this relevant to our lives? We have so many different categories of Buddhism now, the 3 turnings of the wheel, even 4 by some counts. And what do they have in common? How are they different in terms of how they're practiced, and what kind of different, you could say, psychological dispositions are sort of associated with each of these? So in any case, in my case, since you asked me, what sort of drew me to these practices, it was the high mountains, it was the wildness of these places. And I think Chatral Rinpoche saw that, in me as a 19-year-old. And so basically just sent me off to wild places, and so that began a relationship. Basically, when I would come back and he'd ask me what experiences I had and this and that. So the whole teaching and the unfolding was based upon feedback between what I experienced And then he would give me kind of a new assignment and a new sadhana that was both on the one hand existential, because it would involve going off to these remote places, and on the other hand it was, it was following the traditional course of Vajrayana Buddhism, which has its own set of sequence of practices. And so that was really what drew me in, was the magic of the Himalayan landscape and ecosystems. My initial interest in the art, and then through that into actual practice, and that practice being inseparable from a relationship with a Tantric Buddhist master. Yeah.
Very good. But why the yogas? Because we see many things in your books related to expeditures, research, secret aspects and lands, the Beyul, as you mentioned, but also we see a lot of yoga going deep into the yoga. So why this, Dr. Ian?
Why now? That very particularly because, as we know, in Vajrayana Buddhism, it's generally, for those who may not be familiar with it, it has sort of two divisions. You could say the creations phase, the creation stage, where you're working very actively with the imagination and visualization and actually imagining yourself as a tantric deity, as an embodiment of wisdom and compassion. And then you have these completion stage practices which follow that, in which you actually are using, rather than the imagination, you're working more with sensation and more with a kind of just internal awareness that you cultivate. You move through the system of chakras and the nadis of the body in order to awaken a kind of wisdom that is actually embodied within us. It's always there and we can access it directly, but the yogas are specifically designed in order to bring increased awareness of those inner qualities, and particularly in the Vajrayana, which in a certain sense represented and we think of Mahayana Buddhism, its great emphasis on the one hand on emptiness, in other words, sort of just the relative nature of phenomena, but also on compassion. As the Bodhisattva vow, so the sattva, this idea that you work, your practice is for the benefit of all beings. So Vajrayana even takes that a step further, and the whole idea, let's say in earliest Buddhism, which is dukkha, which is this sort of unsatisfactoriness of life. And if we look at Sanskrit, the opposite of dukkha is sukha. It's the happiness. It's this bliss. It's this that overturn. If there's sukha, there's no dukkha. So the idea, if dukkha is the first noble truth, that life is characterized by dukkha, the very bold move, you could say, of Vajrayana Buddhism, the third turning of the wheel, was to say, well, the great antidote to dukkha is sukha. So this emphasis on cultivation of bliss is so important in the completion stage of Vajrayana. And it's important that it's the completion stage, not the development stage or the creation stage, because if you just cultivate bliss from the outset, this does not lead to sort of wisdom and insight. It can lead to great inflation of the ego and abuse of power, and also just a kind of inflation of desire rather than actually a moderation of desire. Because the real beauty, even in our, in the English language, bliss, when there's bliss, there's actually no desire, because it's been eclipsed. Desire is always about subject object. Bliss has no subject object. It's a state of awareness. And so it sometimes, in English, bliss sounds a little bit, trivial, but, when we look at it in its subtle manifestations in Vajrayana, it's a very powerful, self-transcendent state of awareness, which is not just empty in a nihilistic sense, but is actually has this feeling tone, of what we would have, let's say, in our European tradition, it literally ecstasis. In other words, ecstasy, which is to step out of the self, is already a self-transcendent state. But if we had only ecstasy in the way the ancient Greek cult of Dionysus or something, this can get a little bit out of hand. So this
Yes.
beautiful idea of Vajrayana being characterized by bringing the realization of emptiness or open, spacious dimension of being, combined with self-transcendent states of awareness that are inflected by a state of just pure and pleasurable feeling and awareness is really what the completion stage yogas are about. So I thought these are also generally considered the most sort of hidden secret of, or they have been historically. And there's something we'll talk about. It's just more and more it is coming out of the box in a way. And I think usefully, because I think, we've reached a stage in global human civilization where, it just doesn't really kind of work to, and that there's also you could say it, hopefully a maturity to allow certain practices to be actively engaged with without the kinds of so-called dangers that they were perceived to have. And I would say especially within Buddhist monastic contexts. So we have to really understand that a lot of the secrecy developed because these were practices that were not appropriate for monks or nuns, because they could.
I was going to precisely ask you this, since we are entering already into this, the secret aspect. I would like to ask you about exactly about this. What is your opinion on the secrecy and the question of secrets in Vajrayana tradition? You were precisely mentioning about monasticism. Can we please go on this?
Absolutely. Well, if we really look at, these yogas in the Vajrayana tradition as they developed in India and then were introduced, from the 8th century and particularly from the 11th century onward in Tibet, they developed within this sort of the Siddha culture, the Mahasiddhas. The Mahasiddhas were these great, there were sort of 85 canonized Siddhas who were great adepts, male and female, and there were certainly many more, but there were 84 who became particularly famous. And they were all incredible sort of individuals whose own, who may have been priests, they may have been abbots of monasteries, they may have been kings, they may have been sorceresses or anything, but who basically discovered that realization, that awakening, enlightenment was actually something that happened right in the middle of the heart of their own life and existence, that which was most. And so they're famous examples, like probably the most famous of these so-called Mahasiddhas was Saraha. And Saraha had been a priest and essentially a renunciate. But he recognized that that his practice wasn't really going where it was meant to go. And so he ended up marrying the daughter of an arrowsmith. And he famously said in one of his songs of realization, "Only now am I truly a monk." And what he meant by that is not that he was a monk in a sense of having renounced life, but actually whatever qualities you're meant to achieve through that renunciation, he discovered not in renunciation, but in integration and in intimacy. And so the beauty and the power of all the Mahasiddhas is that they're all based upon intimate relationships, both with the passions of their life in terms of vocation and activities, but even most particularly, they're for the most part all partnered figures whose realization was dependent upon the recognition that we don't live as isolated beings, that renunciation isn't and denying our humanity is not really what we're here in this precious human birth. That maybe that's not the purpose. Doesn't allow us the fullest exploration of who and what we are. At the same time, it allows an intensification. The renunciation, the monk-nun path, it makes life, to some degree, if you have that disposition, it makes life easier, because there's just so many things you just don't have to deal with anymore, and you have rules to follow, and you have, you don't, the potential for sort of getting sidetracked into emotional entanglements and all of that should be less, although we know in practice it doesn't really work that way. But the point is that the Siddhas were the same ones who introduced all these kind of ecstatic practices of the completion stage into Buddhism. working with the tumo, the inner fire, the partnered sexual yogas, all of these things that worked with a kind of intensification of the energetic substrate of our human existence, of our anatomy. And so all of this was a bit problematic if you tried to, you couldn't really teach those things, in monastic settings, because it would be upsetting to the whole system. So the very simple way of, historically, of understanding that is looking at in the early 11th century when Atisha, this great teacher, went from Bengal to Tibet to teach Buddhism. And it was a time when Vajrayana Buddhism was very prominent, and he had a lot of background in that. But he said, in Tibet, if those who have taken monastic vows should not ever receive the third empowerment, which is, we always think of the four empowerments in Vajrayana Buddhism, but the third empowerment was historically about the introduction of partnered sexual yoga. And through the bliss of that, and through the transcends desire, and then that was the fourth empowerment that arose out of that, was to recognize this state in which bliss and desire and intimacy could all exist without any kind of grasping, without any kind of possessiveness, without any kind of proprietary, all the things that basically bring relationships down. All the preparation for the third empowerment was to prevent that from happening, so and then one would recognize also that bliss was also not dependent upon an external partner. It was something inherent within our own biophysiology. And that was really the pointing out of the fourth, that was the fourth empowerment, which is the pointing out of this as being our own, sahajananda, the natural, innate state of our own consciousness is there. And that these are other practices are just ways of enhancing it. And they're situational. They're not things that one has to seek out or depend upon. When they arise, and they can be worked with. But the point of all of this was to point out that the nature of the mind was not just emptiness, which could veer into nihilism, but is actually innately blissful. And that really, brings us to, the whole Vedanta view. It's similar, this idea of Chit Sat Ananda, it's just being, consciousness, and bliss, in a certain sense, explains it somewhat more more accessibly. But the point is, this is why the secrecy was introduced, because it was problematic in a monastic institutional context based on vows of celibacy to introduce completion stage practices that relied upon an intensification of blissful awareness, and with the possibility of enhancing that through partnered sexual yoga. It just doesn't work. So that all had to be kept very much hidden. And as a result of it not being appropriate in a monastic setting, it just became kind of across the board considered sort of secret teachings that those even lay people who would not have been subject to vows of celibacy, for example, it just became not so accessible. And also because of most of the abbots of these monasteries that people would go to as lay people for teachings that were themselves celibate, and themselves couldn't openly practice these practices, even if they did secretly. So the secrecy became something that was just an institutional decision in many cases, as a way that the actual practices could be perpetuated, but without transparency and without honesty. And this is why we've been led to so many of the problems that we've seen, in Western kind of Vajrayana, where we put so much value on transparency and openness. And yet there was an institutional structure within Vajrayana that didn't allow these practices. They were continued, but they couldn't be done so openly. And that created a kind of, psychological
this misunderstanding, a big misunderstanding of what secret really is, and what is a convenient secret, right?
Exactly. Yes. And what's just polite, secret just simply because it's private, let's just say. Private matters versus secret matters, where secrets can be seen as being problematic, but there are times when privacy is, private matters are not to be openly. This
is very interesting, because I remember to see an interview with you before, where somebody was mentioned to you about your book and about the these paintings in His Holiness in the temple, and that you mentioned that His Holiness Dalai Lama said like, oh, you are practicing this, Tibetans should be practicing this, referring to those pictures, right, to those designs, to those paintings.
Right.
Means that is not secret at all.
Well, what he literally said, and even in the foreword that he wrote, the introduction to that book, he said, time of secrecy is over.
Yes.
He said more misunderstanding arises from trying to keep things secret than it does from trying to explain things very, very thoroughly. Yes. So that's, I had no plan to do that book originally. It was because he requested it, these so-called secret paintings from the murals in what had been a private meditation chamber of the sixth Dalai Lama. They were painted around 1700, so more than 300 years ago. But even those are not, they're dealing with Dzogchen more than Tantra. But at the same time, they are considered to be the hidden teachings because they, in some ways, in this context of Dzogchen, they are considered so advanced that they, in other words, there's no dependency on any of the institutional structures of monasticism.
Yes.
And that's literally why he said it's so important for Westerners to understand this level of practice, because we don't come from a cultural background of that monasticism is the highest good or something like that. Whereas and also the Dzogchen teachings are meant to be given on to people who have kind of an intellectual capacity or ability to understand them without prejudice or preconception. And certainly, in the West, when our education has served us in many ways, even if secular education at least allows us to see things in comparative perspective without, ideally without bias and preconception. And then in doing so, we can see the power and relevance of Dzogchen, the so-called great completion practices, which is what arises out of what we were talking about as completion stage practices, in which you don't even, you don't have to rely upon all these so-called secret yogas. It's a direct intuition of that, bliss, clarity, and non-conceptual spacious awareness that is, in fact, the nature of our mind when we, in a sense, no longer identify with our, transient thoughts and emotions that may bring us into a swirl of doubts and,
in a neurotic stage.
Yeah,
this neurotic stage, right?
Yes, exactly.
Very good. So tell me, Dr. Ian Bacon, how are Tibetan forms of physical yoga different from Indian Hatha yoga? What are the differences and similarities from a physical and psychological point of view?
Well, if we look at the earliest evidence, you could say, of physical, what we would think of, when we think of yoga today in the Western world, we're thinking very much of postural yoga, of postures, positions, and basically, asana. Asana. It's advanced stretching exercises in a sense, and those were very much what we see early on in Tibet. From the beginning of the 11th century, we see these as stretching exercises that were introduced, for example, in the Kalachakra Tantra, probably has the first evidence of named asanas and descriptions of physical yogic practices. And there's a lot of, very interesting, that's again been kind of a hidden, that aspect of Kalachakra has never really been emphasized publicly. And yet, the forthcoming work of Niraj Kumar, I think, will be a lot of wonderful new revelations about the hidden.
I'm delighted. I can't wait
to interview him. I think will be a great treat, because the hidden treasures of Kalachakra. And just on that note, because I've had a lot of recent dialogue with him, and I think it's so interesting to see how, by his going back to these original Sanskrit Buddhist sources, how many things were, in a certain sense, reconstrued, you could say, for in a Tibetan monastic context, because it was never a monastic tradition. And it was very much, and the 6 Vajra yogas of the Kalachakra very much involve physical yogas. And again, when you think of any kind of meditative lifestyle, you really need to get up and move. You need to stretch out the limbs. So there was just very practical, and as he's explained, and as also other traditions in Tibetan physical yoga explained.
Yes.
It's part of this is for self-healing and preventive health. In the same way, the Neijang tradition, which also Dr. Nida Chinangsang teaches, which also developed out of the Kalachakra Tantra. It was both for self-healing and to keep yourself healthy, and at the same time, with added, if you add sort of pranayama into it, then it became supportive of accessing, you could say, these sort of self-transcendent states of awareness. So it had both a practical as well as a spiritual dimension to it. So in that sense, I don't think there is initially, we think of Hatha yoga in the West as we're talking about Indian yoga. But we also know that the Kalachakra Tantra, the commentary to the Kalachakra Tantra, the treatise on stainless light from the early 11th century, was the first Indian text to ever use the word Hatha yoga.
Yes.
And that's something very important to realize, because then we realize that Hatha, which means forceful, in other words, vigorous yoga, as opposed to yoga, which means just opening and joining, our own consciousness to the great, the vast expanse of reality, which can be done without force. But the effortful, forceful techniques that could sort of break through the barriers, if we think of those as Hatha yoga, that was there, in the Kalachakra. So that was a text that was both a source for later Indian Hatha yoga, and certainly for the Trulkhor, or the physical yogas in Tibet. So I think at their core, there isn't great difference. But I think what happened historically in India, certainly from the time of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is kind of the 15th century text, which basically says in its own introduction, these were practices, physical practices drawn from the Tantras that could be a benefit to anyone, living a householder life. And this is when you began to have the emphasis on the satkarmas, on the purification, on the just a health protocol, a fitness protocol, you could say, that also had a spiritual dimension, but in a certain sense, it became relevant within a secular society. And that's why I think yoga, and it was again, there was no secrecy involved at that point. So this is why, Hatha yoga in the West, could thrive and flourish to the degree that it did, let's say, because it was drawn from the Tantras, which were all based on secret initiations and guru-disciple relationship, but Hatha yoga became something that was accessible to all. And that, I think, is very, very important, because Tibet didn't go that direction. They kept it really hidden. And I think it's only been in the last couple of decades that teachers such as originally Chogyal Namkha Norbu, for others, have started to recognize that, hey, what we have in these physical yogas in Tibet is really not much different than what's being taught down at the local, YMCA on weekends, and that everybody's benefiting from. So, to kind of answer that question even further, I think, Namkha Norbu Rinpoche, from 1982, he started teaching what he called yantra yoga. In the West. And yantra yoga was his translation of Trulkhor, which is the Tibetan word that Trulkhor literally means sort of illusory, magical wheel, but yantra meaning a kind of configuration, in this case, of the body and the mind and the breath, in order to achieve a psychological, spiritual transformation. So in his introduction to the first published work on, you could say, Tibetan physical yogas, it's called Yantra Yoga, Tibetan Yoga of Breath and Movement. In the 1982 introduction that he wrote for that, which was, the book didn't come out until 2008, but his introduction is still from an earlier work that was actually only in Tibetan language. But it's important, because what he says in that is that these are practices that can benefit anyone, whether or not they are followers of Vajrayana Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. They bring about a state of balance within our prana, within our inner energy system, and a deep state of relaxation, therefore bringing the mind and the body into a state of natural presence. So this was very important, because what, in a certain sense, he initiated, from the 1980s by teaching these practices openly as foundations for people's everyday lives rather than as secret practices to be done only after years and years in a monastery or in a remote cave. It shifted things. And at first he was highly criticized for it. And then in the end, it became a new norm. And now we have many different models of physical, Tibetan physical yoga being taught openly. We had, Tuku Tenzing Wangyal in the Lingchimi Institute, for the Bön tradition. These are also being used as healing protocols for patients in hospices with cancer. Very powerful, using powerful methods that once would have been secret, but now showing that they have benefit for everyday people. Or Dr. Nida Chanangsang's work with the Neijang, a more accessible form that doesn't involve some of the really complex movements. And then there's also Tuku Lobsang, in his own work with Tumo and Trulkhor. And I think increasingly what I observe, at least in all of that, let's say taking Tuku Lobsang's work, for example, is that he's very open about the fact that he's adapting an incredible range of practices from a diverse lineages to a new context of teaching Westerners in a in a secular world, methods that he thinks will benefit them most. So in a certain sense, it's total innovation, but it actually shows the way these practices have evolved over time. In the same way that Namkha Nogu's Yantra Yoga, I mean, it's very hard, even though it's said that these go back to the time of Aitochan in the 8th century, we're actually seeing postures that we don't otherwise know until the 20th century through modern postural yoga of Krishnamacharya. We've got the camel poses, we don't see those anywhere else in Tibetan yoga, nor do we see them anywhere else, even in Indian Hatha yoga until the 15th century. So the degree of which creativity, innovation, and to some extent branding can is used is creative and is part of our human process.
This will take me to another question I had prepared here for you, and it's just the right moment to do this question to you. Like, can you kindly talk about your research about the monastic reinterpretation of the teachings and of the practices, and if it is a good word here, like reinterpretation? I don't know if it's the proper word or not. It's just the word that I found suitable according to what I have been reading on your works, like your research on this. How about the monastic reinterpret and readjust it to their own convenience, the certain kind of practice, like of the tantric techniques in India, for example?
Yep. Well, I think exactly as I said, let's say, from the early 11th century when Atisha, went to Tibet and essentially established this Kadampa order, which was a highly monastic form of Buddhism in Tibet, and basically said, there's, this is we don't practice Tantra, this is monastic Buddhism. And therefore, there's no third empowerment. There's no partnered sexual yoga. There's none of these things that we, which are fundamental to how tantric yoga in the Tibet, and even in the Buddhist tantras, was originally presented. So that became problematic because obviously there was still going to be a yogic, non-monastic communities who would be very engaged with these practices. But it would also mean that the monastic institutions would sort of lose control of the transmission of Vajrayana as a whole. They would rather than being on top, they would be seen as somehow or other not up to the same standard as householder yogis who might be practicing more advanced practices. So this was, if we just think of it in purely as an institutional context, this wasn't okay. So therefore, as you said, a lot of these advanced yogas had to be retranslated, reinterpreted. And so, for example, if there was partnered sexual yoga in the third initiation, rather than with an actual partner, we practiced what they call the jhana dakini, so a wisdom consort. So it was done through visualization. So you would, a monk who was celibate could nonetheless visualize himself in union. But this was also problematic because, if you actually go back to the Theravada, which is why Theravada Buddhism has often been so critical of Vajrayana, because, well, a monk is not even supposed to think about women. How can you actually visualize it? Even if you're not physically involved, but you're still having, going through an elaborate fantasy. So this is very difficult. And so Ronald Davidson, who's done two extraordinary books on both on the origins and development of esoteric Buddhism in India, and then its later Tibetan Renaissance and its introduction into Tibet, talks about, the most incredibly, it's a beautiful quote from him. I can't remember it offhand, but it basically deals with the monastic community had the most complex, intellectual hermeneutics to try to justify tantric practice within the context of celibate monastic life. And it just never really quite added up. And this is why there's been, so much, and this hasn't really all come out yet, but there's been so much interesting criticism, let's say from the Shaiva, in very intellectual Shaiva Tantra, Abhinavagupta, same time as the Tantra Loka, the same time that Kalachakra was appearing. You had Abhinavagupta with a very sophisticated Tantric Shaivism, basically just talking about how these Buddhists are just get caught in this intellectual trap because everything is supposed to be in renunciation. And so there's this whole, which really comes back to the beauty of the Sattva project. How do we reconcile early Buddhism's this ideal of renunciation? I mean, it's just there, it's inherent. And a lot of it, I think, is just a question of how do we look at these so-called three yanas, the three vehicles, which a lot of emphasis was put in Tibetan monasticism to integrating the three vehicles. Well, that in one level, okay, but it led to so much confusion. Rather, can we not see them as evolutions? So naturally we see that there was also metta, there's loving kindness emphasized in Theravada. That point gets emphasized in Mahayana when you had emptiness, which could easily veer into nihilism. So you really put great emphasis on compassion. So the metta, of just loving kindness, which was fundamental in Theravada, becomes really your overall modus operandi, as a bodhisattva. So therefore, emptiness never becomes a form of just, negation, becomes, the bodhisattva, the compassion expands it. And so very naturally out of that, you had Vajrayana, which emphasized, well, if we're going to have compassion, we're actually going to, and if we have a bodhisattva vow to help, to benefit all beings, we can't remain within a kind of narrow monastic kind of confines, if there is actually pure heartedness, pure mind, pure intention, then there's actually no limit to how we express that compassion and wisdom, in our engagement with the world. And so that is, really the beauty and power and danger of Vajrayana, that it was really about bliss and emptiness rather than just compassion and emptiness, which you had really in the Vajrayana. It was about using bliss to overturn the dissatisfactions and dukkha that characterizes so much of life. So in that sense, and then again, because each of these different yanas had completely different set of vows, and they're irreconcilable. And we've seen issues like that come up even in conferences in Bhutan, where you have monastic communities who are still upholding the top of the hierarchy. So how do they reconcile essentially the Vajrayana vows, tantric vows, which is often in contradiction to the Vinaya system? So so to me, in my own personal view, I see these as a natural evolution, and that it's not just my view. Even Jamyang Kongtrul for Treasury of Knowledge is very, you follow each set of vows supersedes the other. So if you're a Vajrayana practitioner, you're no longer subject to Vinaya vows. But the problem is, okay, you're a Vajrayana practitioner, but you're still a monk in a monastery. That will lead automatically to all kinds of things that from our own Western point of view, completely unacceptable transgressions that have become extremely problematic and widespread. So on one hand, we can say, well, that's not, that's not our culture. That could be dealt with. They can deal with it as they want. But at the same time, the trouble is Westerners who've become, in a way, literally indoctrinated, meaning initiated into a system, and suddenly finding that that level of cognitive dissonance between what's said on the outwardly and what's practiced inwardly becomes unsustainable psychologically. And many, as we see, kind of dharma casualties, people who have been traumatized by thinking that they are following the right path and at the same time following even their own gurus' instructions. And that's leading to a state where they are completely split from their own sense of integrity and self-worth. So this is, a big problem. And I think the Sattva project, by bringing a lot of this out, and by really emphasizing more and more the female voices within different schools of Buddhism, can begin to bring clarity to some of these issues. And a lot of that becomes, in my mind, where the big sources of tension is Vajrayana monasticism. Is it even, does it even make any sense? That's a problem.
I was going to ask you about that, because we are talking here about the monastic system and the monasticism. And I was thinking to myself, in our contemporary world, in our societies, the challenges we face in our societies, is that fit? Is this fit? Is this suitable? What is going to be the future? And besides, also a big misunderstanding we have, and I would like to ask you this question very directly, Dr. Ian. What is a yogi in your perspective?
Okay. Well, to try to answer all those questions in I'll frame it by saying, really, if we go back to origins, let's just say in the Tibetan context, this, according to tradition, when Padmasambhava, the great yogi, the Vajrayana, completely non-celibate, let's put it out there, the great, who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet, was a great yogi. In other words, and at the same time, he had multiple consorts, et cetera, et cetera. And he established at Samye, the first monastery, 2 different orders of practice. Ones were the white-robed Nakpas. They were the yogis who would not be subject to any kind of restrictions of celibacy. They would practice the inner yogas, and that they were to be equally revered as the red robe, and they would follow the tantras. Whereas the red-robed monks, monastics, they followed the sutras. So sutra and tantra were 2 different paths that were established already according to Tibetan tradition from the 8th century as 2 different methods by which one could attain, liberation and enlightenment in this life and express one's own qualities to the highest degree. But they were very, very different approaches. And those were both established, as we understand, from textual sources in Tibet by Padmasambhava, as in a certain sense, it depended on one's individual disposition and life circumstances. Were you going to follow the path of a yogi, or were you going to follow the path of a monk? So to answer your question that way, what is a yogi? So a yogi in the Tibetan context is a Naljorpa. So Neljor, which is the Tibetan translation of yoga, means literally Neljor, means to be united with the natural state of existence. And so with the idea being that our being dukkha, we're kind of a little bit off course. We're not in our full embodied nature. We have somehow or other kind of gotten off course. So the idea of Neljor, the yoga, is to put ourselves back into that natural state. And so a Naljorpa, a yogi in the Tibetan, is one who is united with the natural state. So yes, the idea being that yes, you could be a monk and be completely united with the state, and you're just, off in your cave or you're in your cell and you have absolutely nothing else you depend upon, and you've sort of transcended everything. And that's perfectly possible. So there's no doubt that there were enlightened, monks or nuns who just had no interest in being distracted by all of the things of this world, or having a partner, all of those things that can lead to so much trouble. And at the same time, there were the monks who and nuns who often were in conflict with themselves, because their own natural state of existence, which wasn't celibacy, was somehow always there as a, and that led to, as we know, so many of the kind of things we continue to see in institutional Vajrayana today, where there's a discrepancy between the vows and the behaviors of even those at the very highest levels of teaching. So that really comes to the other part of your question is, to what degree, and most in the West, there are very few, I would say, the percentage of Westerners interested in Vajrayana Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism who have the inclination or disposition to become monks is very, very, very little compared to those who are lay practitioners and who are, in a certain sense, more interested in how they can integrate their worldly life into their spiritual life, which is exactly what Vajrayana says, that samsara and nirvana are not different. They're just, it's a question of how we understand reality. And if there's this non-dual understanding, then it's about, using the energy of samsara to propel our journey to nirvana. So rather than having to cut off this and that and follow rules and regulations of a 2,500-year-old institution, one can question how relevant that would be for Westerners today who have been educated.
Not only for Westerns, also for Easterns. We must
realize.
Yes,
and I guess yes.
This is
exactly
very important discussion, because in Asia, in the East, we have Taiwan, we have Singapore, Malaysia, we have so many countries with so many young people. Is this suitable?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think the whole idea of East-West as a distinction isn't really so relevant anymore. We're really talking about modern and tradition, modern and traditional. So from a traditional point of view, so many of these institutions are dedicated to perpetuating the lineage, perpetuating the institution, including its funding sources, et cetera. And it has a certain kind of image to maintain. I mean, this is just any institution is going to be involved with that. And the question is, how much is that relevant to modern young people, especially in the West and in the East, who have been educated in a more global context of science and history and so many other things that were really never part of a traditional education.
Artificial intelligence.
And artificial intelligence to begin with, exactly, which kind of goes beyond the normal creation stage practices. It's like, who are we? So we can answer those. The whole idea of anatta, which is another, fundamental Buddhist idea of the not self. Well, we just know rather than not self, it's not that we don't exist. It's just that we don't exist the way we think we do. And that illusion doesn't mean that things don't exist. It just means they don't, they don't exist the way we think they do. And so to be an artificial intelligence gives us so much insight into the relative nature of identity and what's appropriate in one context in terms of how we image or project ourselves, whether as a tantric deity with multiple arms and heads, or whether it's as a extraterrestrial robot. I don't know. There are just so many ways, in a certain sense, that we have, in the current world, and it can be confusing. And therefore, to some degree, I can understand the appeal of the monastic world for those who just, and it's a legitimate to feel overwhelmed by contemporary life, and all you want is just the kind of the straight and narrow path, be told what to do by rules that were established 2,500 years ago. But the question becomes, to what degree we want to engage critically. Just to take an example, and that again, it changed over time. But if we go back to the early Theravada, which is still as it's practiced in Thailand traditionally, you don't eat after 12 noon. Well, why don't you eat after 12 noon? It's because it was based upon going out at dawn before people went out to their fields to work with your begging bowl, and you got food. And if you, in a hot tropical country, didn't consume that by noon, by the midday sun, you was going to have bacteria and you were going to get sick. So there was a practical reason for some of these regulations.
There was a context.
The context is gone. We don't have that anymore. So do we find it meaningful to just follow rules that had relevance 2,500 years ago, but have no practical relevance today? Or do we, use our creative minds and adapt, and at least be aware that we're following a tradition in that context, let's just say in terms of when you eat and when you don't. Of course, Tibetans adapted that, and they don't, they'll still have their evening meal, or they'll have, there are different ways in which the things get altered over time. But sometimes they're altered without any recognition of what the original, why they're changed. And therefore, there's not the critical insight and awareness, which we also understand to be fundamental to Buddhism. So if we're just following things without awareness and insight, then we can't really even say we're Buddhists, to me. If Buddha means to be awake and we're just following a system
without questioning,
uncritically, without questioning, without awareness, then we're not following the example and the words of the Buddha, or the words attributed to the Buddha, since nothing was written down on his own lifetime until 200 years later. But he said, weigh my words like a goldsmith weighs, gold, and follow them to the degree to which they are relevant in your own life. But, that's the bottom line. And then, therefore...
then we can go to another place from here, very interesting. That is the question, no East, no West. But, for example, we realize that in the East, it's very usual. People get into a monastic system because of their financial situation. Because if they are not going to a monastery or a nunnery, they will not be able to study. They will not be able to have an education. So what we see is many people that have been in monasteries or that are following a monastic path. It was not by devotion or properly because they choose to, but because life forced them to that, or situation and context and economical aspect brought them into this. What do you have to say about this? Like, where is the devotional aspect, the dedication to the Dharma and all of that? Because also you have so many monastics that then they do retreat, and now they are lamas, they come and teach in the West and everything. And it's not a question of saying that they lack devotion. No, it's not, nothing of that. But in a sense, it's like in the Catholic religion, you have many people that went to priest because it was the only way to study and to be fed.
Yes,
it is exactly the same.
Yeah,
only the context was different.
Yeah, no, exactly. Just the way in the Middle Ages in Europe, the only place you could get an education was to go to the monastery. And so then there weren't universities, in that sense that there are today. And actually, just as an aside, like the first universities, like Oxford University, were very much based. They were almost religious institutions. They were so based upon Christianity, interestingly. So there were, it was almost like a monastery, to be studying at Oxford in its earliest incarnation. But yeah, certainly, as you say, what we see still in the Himalayan world today, and is that young people are sent to the monasteries to out of economic necessity, and they get a certain kind of education, and they are taken care of to a certain degree. But it's problematic because they're not, I think even in the Buddha's, no one was allowed to become a bhikkhu or a monk until a certain age. It had to be a personal choice. It wasn't something that your parents could decide for you. But again, out of cultural adaptation and necessity, that changed in the Himalayan world. And, you've got tiny little, little people being, made into monks and nuns before they even, hardly can speak. So they are, on a positive sense, the way it would be seen from within the tradition, well, that's great, because right from the outset, they are being trained, they are being indoctrinated as Buddhists with all of the values and bodhisattva orientation that entails. So from a traditional point of view, that makes sense. But even as people like the Dalai Lama have done, they said it's very important that secular, science, for example, is introduced into the curriculum of monasteries, and particularly for the training of tupu, so for so-called reincarnate lamas who are going to be teachers in the future. It's very important that their education not be limited just to traditional curriculum. So one hopes that if that's the case, and monasteries in Bhutan and Nepal and Sikkim and those places like that can begin to introduce, which they have to some degree, even English language or, basic science. If there's if there's, some degree of secular education happening simultaneously, then, I think that's a positive way of using the cultural resources of Buddhist monasteries to promote education more generally, that gives more options for those individuals as they grow up and then decide whether they want to stay in a monastic life or if they want to, in a certain sense, graduate the way you would from any school. So I think this is the challenge that would be put upon governments within those countries. How do you, and especially if those are school age individuals,
yes,
to what degree monasteries would be required? How would their curriculum be adapted so that those children who are essentially in a monastic context have options available to them at a critical, they might turn 16 to decide that the last thing they want to do is be a monk or a nun. But if they haven't had any training for anything else, they're stuck. And that's a big problem. So that, I think the challenge there is the Ministry of Education in countries like Bhutan or Nepal to begin to look at providing practical, vocational, and you could say, and a more secular education along with the traditional Buddhist curriculum.
Yeah. Very good. And also you may notice that in the monastic environment, we already have difference between gender difference in Buddhism, right? But especially in the monastic environment, it is very, very deep. We can realize it very deep, the way that monks are supported and nuns are supported, the way monks are taught and the way nuns are taught. So would you like to give a word on this? What do you have to say?
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing. I mean, we know that, for example, in the last 10 years, there's so many, even like Ching Palden, others have put so much emphasis on trying to get the same level access to initiation and to training for nuns as the monks get without the same difficulty, and really trying to in that way really support nuns in being able to advance their own knowledge and training within the traditional Buddhist system. I have a little bit of controversial perspective on it to begin with, which is that we know from the beginning the Buddha, we know from what was written about him or words attributed to him 200 years after he passed away, that he was very resistant to actually even having nuns join the order. He said this will actually shorten the life of Dharma. So, a lot of very misogynist sort of things they're saying. But the point is, I think on another level, I mean, this probably sound kind of heretical to some, but it was a men's club. The whole idea of renunciation, the whole idea of that it offered, if we look at it in its cultural and social context, this was definitely a men's order. It was a men's club. And so for 21st century women to try to join a 2,500-year-old men's club, why would you want to do that? Why don't you do something better? Why don't you recreate? Why don't you examine every single one of the 250 vows of the Vinaya and say, well, which ones are relevant to us today? Which ones are going to further our awakening and allow us to be more creative and more compassionately engaged with all beings, human and non-human? How do we serve the earth? Why not recreate the whole thing according to your own enlightened vision, bringing together a council only of female who want to actually do better than what the Vinaya has done for today? We see its limitations. We see the power, of course, of an ancient institution and the support that it gets from, governments of Thailand and everything else. But I think there's an incredible opportunity for incredible creativity, innovation, and imagination on the part of very advanced female practitioners to overturn a system and say, look, we can do better today. And the situation in the world is so different that there's no meaning to be kind of just adhering to 2,500-year-old rules for men.
Yeah, even
That's
because we have the right and obligation, in my point of view, to educate future generations. So you cannot go into educate future generations if you don't approach issues like your body in our days. This is totally not possible.
Exactly.
Because you mentioned that about Vinaya, when I was in a London conference in 2017 and I presented a paper about nuns and their health, I mentioned about some points of the Vinaya code, especially some points that are just for nuns, because nuns, they have more vows
Yes.
they have more vows than monks. And then in those vows, there are particular items that are really, like maybe not very suitable for the 21st century, especially for the benefit of the own health nun. So it's the kind of thing that we need to discuss very openly and mindfully, but with awareness. And I think people should, in our days, begin to look at their bodies and to the sexual question with naturality, because this is it's not possible to go and deal with young people and with the future totally rejecting, repressing, and all of this. This has got created so many mental sickness around. So I think it's time for us to wake up for this. So yeah.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's really, and I think this is what's wonderful with, the Sattva project, because you have nuns, you've got from diversity of lineages and traditions involved, who are also beginning to critically engage with their own traditions to really draw out, what it is that they feel about the possibility of reform. And what is it that, for example, might cause a particular nun in a Vajrayana order, a Tibetan order, to remain so? What is it that actually, what is the choice being based upon, and what are the potential, you could say, existential challenges that are a way, in a sense, being avoided? To what degree does those decisions to stay within an institute, within essentially a male institution as it was originally founded, what is one avoiding, and what is one gaining, and to what degree we look at the consequences of that. And so I think that would be a really important way. And I think there's also interesting, I also aware of women in contemporary Vajrayana communities in Thailand, for example. I'm thinking of the Vajrasiddhi Institute, which was founded by actually the nephew of Buddhadasa from Swanmukh, the Garden of Liberation, who was himself a Theravada monk, but actually had a very Mahayana disposition. And his nephew, who essentially was the inheritor of that institution, but who studied Vajrayana under Reggie Ray, for example, and has brought those teachings and adapted them to a Thai context. And a lot of mostly women involved in that community. And I think they are all very much engaged in a very creative kind of questioning of the role in which Vajrayana can serve to kind of bring a new vision of what Buddhism can be for the 21st century, with a much more, rather than a rejection of sensuality and human embodiment, more than just an acceptance, but how do we actually use the endowment of our own human nature to actually bring more joy and peace and love into the world, and therefore to, which is the whole idea of Buddhism, which was if we take the Four Noble Truths, it's a journey from dukkha to the extinction of suffering. And how do we bring that about in practical terms that's at the same time works with tradition but makes appropriate adjustments and innovations, and through the arts and sensuality. So I think that would be a very...
By your words, we can understand that lay practitioners have huge responsibility in the future and need to be encouraged, need to understand that they can practice with diligence, they can be amazing practitioners and be involved in daily activities in society and even engaged. Many people has got problems to mention engaged Buddhism. But I think in our times that is really necessary. We need to not only have the teachings in our mind and run away from those aspects. We need to face them. That is a wonderful way to practice, to face the emotions all the time in our daily lives and have to deal with so many circumstances like COVID-19, for example, at this moment, that changed our life just in 1 year.
Yes.
And then suddenly you have to adjust everything. Suddenly you have to deal with a lot of things that was not supposed to happen. And you have to cancel all your things. You have to schedule again. You have to, yeah, it's the huge teaching on impermanence, I guess. But tell me something, Dr. Ian. Why are the lay and yogi traditions important to preserve Buddhist practice in our modern times? Do you think does it fit in our modern times? Do you think that can be a future?
I think that, well, to start, since you asked both about monasticism and the yogic traditions, I think the monastic tradition probably will continue, but it'll become, a minority phenomena. Let's just say the way that Christianity continues, certainly in the Western world, and yet Christian monasticism is a kind of quite rare. We have the Jesuit traditions and the Trappists, and very, some even up here where I am in Scotland, there's a community of Benedictine monks. But again, it's a sort of I'm not sure how much longer it will prosper, but it's still beautiful to watch, in all, the Gregorian chants, they're going around with the white robes. It's a Benedictine order from a 17th century abbey that has remained virtually unchanged in terms of its practices for, over a millennium almost. And so I think, there's a beauty and a power to that. And I think the people who used to come now, of course, with COVID, it's all shut down. They're all in retreat. But there was a power and a beauty to see a living institution. And for those who are inclined to that, for those who find joy and meaning in being able to preserve a ancient tradition in such context, I think it's beautiful. And I think it's something, and then to open that up as it is in the case of these Benedictine monks who are otherwise living as a hermits, in their case on Sunday Mass, to have lay people come and be able to witness and experience directly the power of the Eucharist. And it's actually beautiful to watch, to experience that. I've done a few times before the COVID set in. So I think that way it will continue, but I think it hopefully would continue only for those who have absolute personal devotion to that way of life and find absolute meaning in it. And it's never done because they didn't have other options available to them. It has to be done out of a spiritual inclination, and that they then, in that context, become examples of the power that comes in that sense from social isolation as a spiritual lifestyle in which they can develop an inner life that then has this power to, the same with compassion and bodhisattva vow in Buddhism, but we also have the Christos, which is the the heart and the charity that is actually inherent within the Christian Catholic tradition just as much. So I think that sense, I hope it will continue. There's a beauty and a power and meaning that monasteries throughout the Himalayan world in particular give to people. I think that they can serve if they are developed further, though along the ways that the Dalai Lama, for example, has proposed, and they become Buddhist universities, maybe the way Moral Nalanda was originally, where they taught sciences, they taught astrology, they taught medicine. They became, they had a Buddhist, they were like Catholic schools. It doesn't mean you only taught Catholicism, you taught everything else. Like Jesuit schools are some of the best. People get some of the best education, secular education at Jesuit schools, because there was a rigor, an intellectual rigor to them. So I think if Buddhist schools, if you will, as monasteries could take a little bit of inspiration from the Jesuit universities, I think that would be an interesting way to go. I think there's a lot to be said there. And as far as the yogic path, I think again, it depends on, I mean, there's so many different levels of that. We see, for example, in
Yes.
the West, like traditions in which there's the yogic path, but let's say with attributes. So let's say Arroter, for example, you know, where which is a high fashion, you know, Vajrayana expression. It's beautiful. There's, you know, very, very powerful transmissions, and you could say outer inner secret yogas that have been presented in a very powerful way, with its own kind of aesthetic and meaning and community. And I think you know, have many. I think in some sense, almost as a Western Vajrayana, that's one of the most impressive institutions, you could say. And it's not monastic, but it still has an institutional context to it. It's still based upon certain vows of how you conduct yourself, but also how you dress, et cetera, how you wear your hair. So that all, I think, still will have a place, but again, only for people who feel that that's the way they want to go. It's not nothing. I think more and more there'll be, you know, as my own teacher Chatral Rinpoche emphasized, was the, you know, the Sangwan Altar. There's the way of the secret yogi, which is, in other words, there's nothing. And he used the examples of one of the earliest Vajrayana masters was Indrabhuti, you know, who was a king, you know, and no one knew that he was actually a practitioner until when he died. He just turned into a photonic rainbow body and vanished. In other words, his practice was so internal that it was never even evident to anybody on the outside world. And that was what he was saying is the highest practice. So we have these different levels. There's the monastic, there's the yogic with attributes, and then there's the hidden yogi tradition, where we just basically bring this view of non-duality into, which is essentially the Dzogchen view, which is this idea, you know, if we think of Mahayana, Anu Yoga, and Ati Yoga, we're talking about those same three levels. And we're also talking about the consequences of the fourth empowerment, which is basically when you've taken bliss and emptiness, and the existential outcome of that is just to live in a state of open presence. And we kind of go beyond all these earlier stages of mindfulness, which can, not only does it have it has the sense of what, you know, the watcher, which has got this subtle dualism, not even subtle, it's an overt dualism. Watch the mind, watch the, no, be the mind, just be this, be the dance of the mind, and do that with joy, with love and compassion and openness. And that's the path. And therefore it's no longer about a goal. It's the, you know, the path is the goal. And because if you do everything with joy and love, and there's meaning in the whole thing. So again, whether we isolate ourselves to do that and pray for all sentient beings, or we dance with all sentient beings, these are basically the two, you could say, the two polarities, I'd say, of the future. And sattva, as you've done with your project, is about bringing more clarity, integrity, and awareness to all of those different choices that may be some suitable for some, and other approaches more suitable for others.
Yes, it's because, you know, in our days, most of us, we use smartphones and all of that, right? And we have to upgrade things all the time. New systems are always coming, so we need to upgrade. Otherwise, we will not be able to talk or to do video because we don't have the upgrade of the app.
Exactly.
So in a ironic and just quite a funny expression, we can say that maybe in Buddhist traditions, we need to do some upgrade, because otherwise these apps will not work for the future generations, because we are not talking same language. No. We are not going directly to the young people's heart, because it's sometimes too much philosophic, sometimes too much deep. They think, oh, I don't understand this is too much deep, or then too much strict in some kind of practice. Then they get scared only to think about it. Because this new generation, we must realize, and I think this is something important, we must realize that thing in the last 40 years, they changed so much in a short period of time. Suddenly you are doing video conference, you are doing everything online, banks are relying on online systems. who could imagine this? So how can you speak to young people and to these new generations with the same language you used 2000 years before?
Right.
So this is just the question. That's I think it's important to have people like you, Dr. Ian Baker, and many others in the Dharma, in many traditions, to bring this awareness and to realize that we need to upgrade and we need to embrace the changes, not rejecting them and not resisting change, because this is something very problematic, being always resisting the change. And then when you try to do something and implement a new system, then you are going against the tradition, or you are not respecting the tradition, all this, all that. We just need to maybe upgrade some traditions, otherwise they maybe will die.
Yes, yes. Well, and especially I think in Vajrayana, so in Tantric Buddhism is often referred to as Taplam in Tibetan, which means the path of methods, the path of techniques. So exactly as you say, if we rely only upon techniques and technology from 1,000 years ago or before, without any upgrade, it doesn't make any sense. It's just illogical. So, you know, we know so much more now from neuroscience and other things about how the mind and the body function. That there's lots of scope to begin to engage.
If you don't make use of this information to educate from a different perspective, how do you want to have informed societies and informed practitioners?
Yeah, exactly. So that's yeah. So I think that's the great work that you have set up for yourself.
No.
Well, I don't mean just you, but I just mean with Sattva, looking across traditions.
It's just a baby, it's just giving the first steps, and it's quite difficult because we realize that bringing all the traditions together is such a huge thing. It's really impressive, but I'm sure with the efforts of everybody, it's going to be positive in some way. But I would like to do a last question, if you allow me.
Yeah.
So what advice will you give to the young generations to practice the Dharma? What would be your advice?
I think my advice would be, which is not just my advice, it's really the heart essence, you could say, of in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, is to recognize that, you know, the Buddha isn't something separate from you. It's not up on a shelf to be prayed to or devoted to. You are the Buddha. The Buddha mind, Buddha nature is this endowment of wisdom and compassion, is our innermost essence. And so that we really, for a younger generation who may have been brought up in a traditional Buddhist context, or else have been introduced to it coming out of a, you know, of a Christian, you know, Catholic devotionalism, is to recognize that the real wisdom of the Buddhist tradition is to recognize, is to recognize our own Buddha nature. In other words, our own continuum of wisdom and compassion. And that's where self-empowerment comes from. So I think this is important, just to remember that all of these complicated techniques, as you mentioned, and all of Vajrayana Buddhism, sadhanas to particular multi-armed deities and multi-headed and this and that, it all comes down to just being able to shift from our own personal preoccupations to this self-transcendent state of bliss and awareness in which we can engage, you know, creatively and lovingly with all of nature and all of humanity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ian Baker, for your time, for this kind words, for your wisdom, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. And I was tempted to request you a new interview for the future about something you mentioned here that is very dear to my heart. And I think it's very important to Buddhists also, that is the Nalanda tradition. I would like to invite you maybe to a next interview to talk about the Nalanda tradition and how important it was, and sometimes seems a bit like forgotten in our days. Would be lovely to talk to you about that. If you are available. Let's see.
I'm sure we'll have opportunities for many more discussions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me into your
really.
Sattva mandala and
thank you so
share
much.
a few ideas.
Thank you. And I hope we can keep in touch.